The United States has just slammed Canadian steel and softwood lumber with some of the harshest tariffs in years. And tonight, Canada is finally answering. If you care about Canada's economy, its independence, and its long-term future, this is the moment you do not want to miss. We're talking about sectors that are not abstract numbers on a spreadsheet. Steel mills, fabrication plants, sawmills, logging communities. Tens of thousands of Canadian jobs tied directly and indirectly to these industries. When Washington raises tariffs by double-digit percentages on steel and lumber coming out of Canada, it is not just a trade move. It is a direct hit on the core of Canada's industrial heartland. For decades, the basic story sounded simple. Canada produces, America buys. Roughly 3/4 of Canada's exports, year after year, flow south of the border. Steel, aluminum, cars, energy, lumber, all moving into a single market just across one very long border. When that market is open, the model works. When that market decides to weaponize tariffs, the model becomes a vulnerability. That's the stress test we're watching play out right now. As U.S. tariffs bite into Canadian shipments, companies are forced into ugly choices. Cut production, delay investments, or start laying off workers. Communities that have survived multiple commodity cycles suddenly find themselves asking a more unsettling question. What if this is not just another cycle? What if the rules of the game themselves are changing? And that is exactly where today's announcement from Mark Carney becomes more than just another press conference clip. He did not walk out to the podium to beg for an exemption or to complain about unfair treatment. He came out to say something very different. Canada is going to limit foreign steel imports, open up hundreds of millions of dollars in domestic demand, and begin turning its own market into a strategic asset, not a weakness. In his words, limiting non-free trade area steel imports will unlock hundreds of millions of dollars in domestic demand for Canadian producers. Instead of letting cheap foreign steel flood in and undercut local mills, the plan is to cut back those tariff-free imports and redirect that demand towards steel made in Hamilton, Sault Ste. Marie, Regina, and beyond. This is not just about surviving U.S. tariffs. It is about rewiring how Canada treats its own industrial base. That marks a crucial reversal. For years, the conversation in Ottawa has often focused on market access. How we sell more into the United States, into Europe, into Asia? Tonight, you are hearing a different axis of strategy. How we make sure Canadian producers have first claim on Canadian demand. How do we use our own infrastructure, our own housing needs, our own public projects to anchor long-term demand for Canadian steel and Canadian lumber? Behind the technical language, reducing tariff-free levels, adjusting import thresholds, fighting dumping, there is a clear strategic message. Canada is tired of being a price taker on decisions made elsewhere. Instead of simply reacting when Washington hikes tariffs, Ottawa is positioning to use its own market, its own procurement, and its own regulatory system as tools of economic defense and, over time, economic offense. This is Canada stepping into a long game. It is not loud, it is not theatrical, and it will not flip the situation overnight. But it starts from a simple recognition. If you depend on one customer for most of your exports, that customer holds the leverage. If you can build a deeper, more reliable home market around your key industries, that leverage starts to shift. So as we break down what Carney actually announced, the limits on foreign steel, the push to buy Canadian, the new protections for workers and firms, keep one question in mind. Is this just a temporary shield against an American terror storm, or are we watching the first real turn in how Canada sees its place in the North American economic order? Stay with us, because what happens next could redefine Canada's economic power for a generation. Now we get into the real pressure point. Foreign steel flooding Canada's market, and the government finally deciding to shut the tap. If you want to understand where this economic confrontation actually bites, this is the part you need to pay attention to. Here is the core of what Mark Carney lays out. Canada is going to deliberately squeeze the space that foreign producers have inside the Canadian market, so that Canadian steelmakers can claim that demand for themselves. First move, non-free trade partners. Up until now, these countries have been allowed to send tariff-free steel into Canada at up to 50% of their 2024 levels. Carney announces that ceiling is going to be slammed down to just 20% of those levels. In plain language, if you were shipping in, say, 1 million tons of steel into Canada under that channel, very soon you will only be allowed 200,000 tons at the old terms. And that is not a symbolic tweak. He spells it out. This shift alone is expected to open up more than $850 million in new domestic demand for Canadian steel producers. $850 million that used to be captured by foreign mills, foreign workers, foreign supply chains, now being redirected on purpose toward Canadian plants. Second move, even some of Canada's friends get less room. 4 non-CUSMA free trade partners. So, countries that do have some agreement with Canada, but are not the United States, Mexico, or part of the main North American trade bloc, their tariff-free quota is being cut from 100% of their 2024 levels down to 75%. That is another slice of the market being carved back and offered to Canadian producers, worth more than $540 million in additional market access. Put those two measures together, and you start to see the pattern. Canada is not only responding to U.S. tariffs. Canada is redrawing the hierarchy of who gets to serve its own steel demand. First priority, domestic producers. Second, trusted free trade partners in North America. Everyone else? Less space, more obstacles, more scrutiny. Why stay now? Why hide there? And why is the palace suddenly so uneasy about Fergie being this close, especially with rumors of a tell-all interview heating up? If you're frustrated with royal double standards, or just curious about what's really happening behind those quiet country lanes, this is a story no one should miss. Want the full breakdown? Watch the complete investigation in our long-form report. Then comes the third move, and this one is about the edges of steel industry, the products that are easy to overlook but strategically important. Wind towers, prefabricated buildings, fasteners, wire products. Carney announces a global 25% tariff on these targeted steel derivative products. A quarter of the value, straight up slapped on imports. Why those items? Because they sit where industrial policy and the green transition meet. Wind towers are tied to renewable energy projects. Prefabricated buildings are used in construction, remote sites, and modular housing. Fasteners and wires are everywhere. If those segments are dominated by cheap imports, Canadian mills are locked out of some of the most promising future demand. So Canada is making a choice. Pay a bit more now on imports in exchange for building capacity and jobs at home. But a policy is only as strong as its enforcement, and Carney knows that. That is why he moves to the fourth pillar, anti-dumping and compliance. The Canadian Border Services Agency will get a dedicated steel compliance team. They are told to enhance detection of false declarations. For example, products routed through a third country to hide their real origin, and to expand online reporting tools so Canadian firms can flag suspicious shipments. This is where the backdrop matters. With U.S. tariffs up, there's a real risk that steel that can no longer easily enter the U.S. tries to reroute into Canada as a backdoor. If Canada does nothing, it becomes a pressure valve for global oversupply, choking its own mills right when they are already under stress from American tariffs. These enforcement measures are essentially Canada saying, no, you will not use us as your safety net. And then there's a quieter but very sharp shift, the temporary horizontal remission of Canadian tariffs on imported steel. Those remissions were introduced to help Canadian businesses cope with the early shock of U.S. tariffs, to keep input costs manageable for manufacturers, food and beverage packagers, and agricultural producers. Now Carney draws a line in time. Those broad remissions will end on the 31st of January, 2026. Why does that date matter? Because it functions as a structural deadline. Between now and that day, Canadian companies that rely heavily on imported steel are being told, adjust your supply chains, line up Canadian suppliers, renegotiate contracts, or invest in processing capacity inside Canada. After that point, the government will not keep shielding you with across-the-board tariff breaks that weaken domestic steel. So when you listen to this section of the announcement as a whole, the logic becomes clear. Canada is turning pressure into a lever. Cut foreign quotas, raise targeted tariffs, tighten enforcement, end temporary relief that undermines local producers. It is not a comfortable transition. Some import-dependent firms will feel squeezed, some project will see costs shift, but it is a deliberate bet that a stronger, more protected domestic base is worth short-term friction. If you are watching this as someone who follows politics and economics, especially in the Canadian context, this is one of those hinge moments. The numbers Carney reads out are not just numbers. They are signals of a country deciding who gets to feed off its own demand. The question now is whether industry, investors, and workers can move fast enough to seize the space that is being opened for them, or whether those billions in redirected demand will arrive before Canada's producers are ready. If the first wave of measures was about closing the door on foreign steel, this next wave is about something even more powerful: Canada deciding to become its own best customer. Here's the shift Mark Carney makes that you really need to catch. He is not only changing who can sell into Canada, he is changing how the federal government spends its own money. And when Ottawa moves to procurement, we are talking about billions of dollars in long-term demand that can anchor entire industries. Carney lays it out in simple terms. Later this year, Canada will roll out a Buy Canadian policy. Any federal contract worth more than $25 million, especially in infrastructure, will have to prioritize Canadian materials, including Canadian steel and Canadian softwood lumber. Think about what that covers: roads, bridges, government buildings, public transit facilities, community centers, water systems, and a long list of projects funded through federal grants and contribution programs. Up until now, those projects could use a mix of domestic and foreign inputs, with costs often trumping origin. After this policy comes into force, the default flips. If you want federal money for your project, and the price tag is above that $25 million threshold, you are expected to source Canadian steel and Canadian lumber first. The message is not subtle. If taxpayers are paying for it, Canadian workers and Canadian producers should be the ones building it. Then Carney zooms into one of the most politically sensitive and economically critical fronts of all: housing. He connects the industrial strategy to the housing crisis directly. Canada needs more homes, fast. The federal government is setting up Build Canada Homes, a new home building agency, with a funding allocation of roughly $700 million next year. And baked into that is another lever: use as much Canadian wood as possible. He explains that by prioritizing shovel-ready, multi-year housing and infrastructure projects that can begin within the next 12 months, and that use Canadian softwood lumber, this agency alone is expected to generate between $70 million and $140 million in new demand for Canadian wood products. That is on top of the demand already in the system. For sawmills, forestry towns, and builders, that is not small money. That is the difference between mothball capacity and steady shifts. So, step back and look at the architecture of what is being built. On one side, tariffs and quotas are pushing foreign steel and foreign lumber out. On the other side, public procurement, housing programs, and infrastructure funding are pulling Canadian materials in. It is a pincer move: squeeze foreign supply, guarantee domestic demand. There is also a political and psychological layer here. For decades, industrial workers across Canada have heard the same lines: global markets will take care of you, trade deals will open doors. Efficiency is what matters. Tonight, the signal from Ottawa is different. The state is saying, we will use our own balance sheet, our own building plans, our own ability to approve or reject projects, to give you a more dependable home market. And notice how quiet, almost technocratic, the language is: prioritize shovel-ready projects. Apply across grants and contribution programs. Ensure Canadian materials are prioritized. This is not the language of a trade war press conference. It is the language of a government quietly rewriting the rules of who benefits from public money. For companies in construction, engineering, and infrastructure, this is a strategic warning shot. If you are bidding on a bridge, a transit line, a large housing development backed by federal dollars, you will need Canadian steel and Canadian lumber in your supply chain. That means new contracts with mills, new logistics patterns, maybe even new investments in processing capacity inside Canada. Firms that move early will be positioned as preferred partners. Those that cling to old import-heavy models will find themselves losing out, not because of a headline tariff, but because of tender criteria. For Canada as a whole, this is a quiet counterstrike to U.S. tariffs. Not matching Washington blow for blow at the border, but using the internal architecture of the Canadian state to lock in demand at home. Instead of asking, how do we get back to the old relationship with the United States? The question becomes, how do we make sure that, whatever the U.S. does, our core industries have a stable base they can depend on here? There will be trade-offs. Some projects may see higher upfront material costs. Some foreign suppliers will complain to their governments and to international bodies. But from Ottawa's perspective, this is about resilience, turning public spending into a shield and a springboard at the same time. And as you listen to this part of the announcement, you can feel the storyline changing. Canada is no longer just defending itself from someone else's trade aggression. It is starting to reshape its internal economy around its own priorities. The next question is If Canada is going to be its own best customer, can it also rewire the way goods move inside the country to make that strategy truly work? That is where the focus turns next. So now we get to the move that decides whether all of this actually works in the real world. How Canada moves its own steel and lumber across its own territory, and who pays the price for that distance. Mark Carney does not romanticize it. He says it plainly. Moving heavy materials across a country the size of Canada is expensive, and if those freight costs stay high, then all to buy Canadian promises risk collapsing under their own weight. So he announces a blunt, structural intervention. The federal government will cut freight rates for transporting Canadian steel and lumber between provinces by 50%. Not 5%, not 10, 50. The mechanism is straightforward. Ottawa will directly fund Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Kansas City Railways to bring those freight rates down. In practice, it means that shipping a load of steel coil from a mill in Ontario to a project in British Columbia, or moving softwood lumber from a sawmill in BC to a housing site in Quebec, suddenly becomes dramatically more competitive compared to importing similar products from overseas ports or relying on U.S. suppliers just across the border. This is where you see the deeper strategy. Up to now, geography has often pushed Canadian companies into a strange pattern. It could be cheaper or easier to import certain materials from abroad into a coastal city than to move them across Canada's own mountains and prairies. That is how you end up with foreign steel and projects sitting a few hundred kilometers from Canadian mills, or imported lumber landing in ports not that far from forests that produce the same product. By slashing interprovincial rail freight costs for steel and lumber, Ottawa is trying to flip that calculus. If it suddenly costs half as much to move Canadian steel from one province to another, the hidden tax of geography starts to shrink. The premium for staying inside the Canadian system falls. The incentive to build domestic supply chains and east-west trade corridors grows. And it is not just about price. When the federal government subsidizes rail freight on core industrial materials, it is quietly choosing rail as the backbone of its internal market. For CN and CPKC, this is a signal. The future is not only in hauling bulk commodities to ports for export, but in stitching together domestic industrial corridors where steel, lumber, and finished products circulate within Canada. Here is the mini turning point inside this announcement. Until now, a lot of the conversation has been framed as Canada versus the United States on tariffs. With this freight decision, the frame widens to Canada versus its own geography. The state is not just responding to what Washington does. It is reshaping the cost map inside its own borders. But none of this holds if foreign producers can still undercut Canadian mills by playing games with origin, dumping, or routing shipments through loopholes. That is why the enforcement and compliance measures, which might have sounded technical earlier in the speech, suddenly look central in this structural shift. The Canadian Border Services Agency is being armed with a dedicated steel compliance team, better tools to detect false declarations, and expanded online reporting so Canadian firms can flag suspicious cargo. This is a defensive wall around the new domestic ecosystem. If you're going to pour money into cheaper rail by Canadian rules and redirect the demand, you cannot allow that system to be flooded with dumped steel sneaking in under fake paperwork. Add it all together, and you can see the emerging architecture. Tariffs and quotas push foreign supply out of prime spots. Procurement and housing programs pull Canadian materials into big projects. Rail subsidies make it cheaper to move those materials from one end of the country to the other. Border and compliance systems guard the perimeter so that the pressure of global oversupply does not blow the whole strategy apart. For provinces, especially those traditionally seen as resource hinterlands, this is potentially transformative. A sawmill in northern British Columbia or a steel plant in the prairies is no longer just producing for export or for its immediate region. With freight costs cut in half and procurement rules lined up in its favor, it can realistically see itself as part of a national grid of projects: homes in Ontario, public buildings in Atlantic Canada, energy infrastructure in the north. Of course, this is not a frictionless shift. Import-heavy distributors will feel squeezed. Some trucking routes may lose business to rail. Certain projects might have to rework their sourcing plans, renegotiate contracts, or absorb short-term disruption as supply chains tilt toward domestic producers. But from Ottawa's vantage point, those are the growing pains of building a more self-reliant industrial core. What we are watching here is Canada trying to turn its geography and its infrastructure from a vulnerability into a strategic asset. Instead of just being a long, thin country feeding raw materials into someone else's market, it is quietly wiring itself to feed its own. The open question as we move forward is whether this structural shift will translate into real security for workers and companies on the ground, or whether they will be left exposed in the transition. That is where the story goes next. All of this still leaves one brutal question hanging over the entire story. While Canada rewires trade rules, rail costs, and procurement, what happens to people on the plant floor and the companies trying to survive the next quarter? This is where Mark Carney shifts tone. Up to now, we have been talking about markets, tariffs, freight, and contracts. Now, he goes straight to the factory gate and the mill yard. He announces that Canada will not just protect its industries on paper. It will put real money on the table to protect workers and give firms the breathing room to change. The first lever is work itself. Carney says Ottawa will help employers keep workers on the payroll by expanding work-sharing programs. Instead of laying off half the staff, a company under pressure can cut back hours across the team and have the federal government step in to cover part of the lost income. And it is not just a token top-up. The income replacement rate is being lifted from 55% to 70%. That is a huge psychological and financial shift. At 55%, a worker might still be forced into panic mode, cutting essentials, falling behind on bills, thinking about leaving the sector entirely. At 70%, it is not easy, but it is survivable. It tells welders, millwrights, saw operators, truck drivers, we expect you to stay. We are planning for you to still be here when this transition lands. Next, he turns to the companies that employ those workers, especially in softwood lumber. Ottawa will inject an additional $500 million into the Business Development Bank of Canada's Softwood Lumber Guarantee Program. That is not a grant. It is credit support, guarantees, and financing that make banks more willing to extend loans to firms that would otherwise look too risky in the middle of a tariff fight and structural overhaul. On top of that, another $500 million will be deployed to the large enterprise tariff loan facility, earmarked for big softwood lumber companies facing liquidity pressure. These are the firms that may be technically viable, with real assets and long-term demand on the horizon, but are at risk of being knocked over by cash flow shocks, delayed orders, new sourcing requirements, shifting freight patterns. Taken together, these $2.5 billion pools are a message to the financial system. Do not abandon this sector at the very moment we are asking to adapt. The state is stepping in as backstop, so that restructuring is possible without mass bankruptcies wiping out capacity we will need later. Then comes a quieter but very telling reform. Ottawa will create a single window for the forestry sector, one point of entry to navigate the full suite of federal supports. If you have ever watched a mid-sized industrial firm struggle through overlapping programs, multiple departments, and endless forms, you know how big this is. A single window turns a maze into a corridor. It frees up management time to focus on actual investment decisions, not just compliance. And Carney does not stop there. He announces a Canadian Forest Sector Transformation Task Force, bringing provinces, territories, and industry to the same table. The mandate is not just to survive tariffs, but to seize new opportunities in softwood lumber and generate new growth. That phrase matters. It signals a pivot from defensive posture to offensive planning, higher value with products, advanced building materials, exports into new markets, and deeper integration with housing and climate policy. This is a turning point in the narrative. Up to this moment, the story could be read as classic damage control. Tariffs go up, government tries to cushion the blow. With these measures, you see something else emerging. By raising income replacement to 70%, expanding work sharing, and unlocking $1 billion in targeted credit, Canada is essentially buying time. Time for workers to stay in their communities, time for mills to retool, time for supply chains to shift toward domestic inputs without collapsing. It is risky. It assumes that the space Ottawa is carving out with tariffs, by Canadian rules, cheaper rail, and financial backstops will actually be filled by renewed, competitive Canadian production, not wasted in delay and indecision. It assumes that the task force will produce more than reports, that the single window will translate into real projects, not just smoother paperwork. But if you are watching as someone who follows political economy, you can feel the stakes. This is Canada betting that it can turn a moment of external pressure into a forced march toward a stronger, more self-reliant industrial base, without sacrificing a generation of workers and firms caught in the middle of the transition. The question hanging over everything now is simple and brutal. Will this mix of protection, support, and pressure be enough to push Canada over the hill into a new equilibrium, or will it leave the country stuck in a costly in-between, paying to hold the line while the global trade order keeps shifting under its feet? That is where the next chapter of this story has to go. So here's the real question underneath everything we've just walked through. Is Canada simply reacting to an American tariff tantrum, or is this the moment it quietly rewrites its place in the North American economy? Mark Carney's language gives us a clue. He never once pretends that Canada can just fix Washington or force the United States to change course. Instead, he talks about what Canada can control, who gets access to its market, how its own government spends its money, how goods move inside its borders, and how workers and firms are protected while all of that is being rewired. That is a big mental shift. For decades, the dominant story has been, the closer Canada is tied into the U.S. market, the safer and richer it will be. Steel, lumber, autos, energy. Push more south, negotiate better access. Keep the border as smooth as possible. Tonight's package doesn't abandon that, but it stops treating it as the only path that matters. It says, in effect, we're going to make sure Canada works for Canadians first, and then we'll see how far the rest of the world wants to meet us on those terms. Here's the twist you should not miss. Even if one day the U.S. rolls back these tariffs, the structures Canada is putting in place do not automatically roll back with them. Once you have a Buy Canadian rule baked into big federal contracts, once you have rail subsidies hardwired into how steel and lumber move, once you have compliance teams and credit facilities up and running, those become part of the new normal. The baseline shifts. That's why this is bigger than one round of tariffs. Canada is building leverage that doesn't depend on the mood in Washington this year or next. A deeper domestic market for steel and lumber. Stronger East-West supply chains. A clearer, faster path for forestry and industrial firms to tap federal support. Workers who have a reason to stay in their sectors instead of walking away at the first sign of trouble. Is it neat and clean? No. There are real risks. If Canada closes the door too fast on foreign inputs and domestic capacity is slow to respond, projects could be delayed or made more expensive. If the new support programs are too bureaucratic, companies could waste precious time and cash navigating them. If governments change and priorities flip, some of these initiatives could be left half-built. But look at the alternative. A Canada that keeps doing what it has always done, leaning heavily on one export market, hoping for good behavior, scrambling whenever tariffs spike, and watching high-value parts of its industrial base erode over time. In that scenario, the country is always on the back foot, always reacting, always absorbing someone else's shocks. What we are seeing here is a different bet. A quieter one, but no less ambitious. Canada is gambling that it can turn external pressure into a catalyst. Use a painful moment in steel and lumber to harden its internal systems, protect its workers, and begin a slow pivot from dependency towards selective self-reliance. Not isolation, not autarky, but a Canada that can say no or not this time with more confidence because it has built more strength at home. And that's where you come in as someone who cares about politics, economics, and Canada's future. Over the next few years, the real test won't be the headlines about tariffs. It will be the projects that get built, the mills that stay open or close, the workers who manage to ride out the transition or don't. It will be whether Canadians push their leaders to stay the course on building domestic capacity or slide back into comfort business as usual as soon as the immediate pressure eases. So here's the closing question I want to leave with you tonight. 10 years from now, when we look back at this moment, will we say that was just another trade flare-up with the United States? Or will we say that was when Canada quietly decided to stop playing only as a junior partner and started shaping its own economic ground rules? Thank you for staying with me through this breakdown. If you want more deep dives like this on Canada's economic strategy and how it navigates pressure from the U.S., China, BRICS, and beyond, make sure you subscribe, share this with someone who follows Canadian politics, and drop your take in the comments. Do you think this is the start of a real shift or just a temporary shield? Your voice is part where the story goes next.